What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Jake Paul, 5 wins and 0 losses, taking on Hasim Rahman Jr., 12 wins and 1 loss. This is obviously the next step-up opponent for Jake Paul and this kind of extraordinary saga going from YouTuber, famous YouTuber, to now professional boxer. And unlike Jake Paul's first 5 professional fights, this 6th fight versus Rahman Jr. is actually taking place against an actual professional boxer. And even the person who Hasim Rahman Jr. is replacing, Tommy Fury, was initially supposed to be Jake Paul's first fight against a professional boxer. But even every step up until this point that we currently find ourselves in, Jake Paul has been stepping up with every opponent, going from Hasim Gibb, YouTuber, to Nate Robinson, former professional basketball player, but not a fighter, but a pro athlete, albeit an undersized NBA player, to then Ben Askren, former Bellator and one MMA champion for a long time, undefeated. It wasn't until Jorge Masvidal ran across the cage and kneed him in the face in the first couple seconds of their fight that Ben Askren earned an MMA loss. So this is, again, a 2-organization champion, but not a striker. A prodigious wrestler, and wrestling pretty much carried most of his MMA career. But he did have a lot of experience fighting serious strikers like Robbie Lawler, for instance. But Jake Paul ended up knocking Ben Askren out almost as badly as he knocked out Nate Robinson. Not quite, but nearly as badly. They didn't give Askren a chance to get knocked down a second time. The ref waved it off after Askren, was wobbly, beat the 10 count, but was still pretty imbalanced. And then Jake Paul fought Tyron Woodley, which I thought was going to be a major step-up fight, and it was. Tyron Woodley, a former UFC champion who defended his title successfully like 4 or 5 times, against the likes of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson twice, Robbie Lawler, Damian Maia. He stopped Darren Till in a title defense. So here is another non-pro boxer, but an MMA fighter who's got a lot of striking experience and has had a lot of success in the stand-up. Although Tyron Woodley himself was technically a wrestler background-wise. So Jake Paul ended up fighting a super close split decision win versus Tyron Woodley in their first fight and went the full 8 rounds, which is notable, the full 8 rounds, because that's one of the questions you have in a boxer or an aspiring boxer who's then going from 4-rounders to 6 to 8 rounders. Jake Paul, in his defense, started his career doing 6-rounders, like the Hasim Gibb one and Nate Robinson were scheduled for 6 rounds. They only lasted 1 round, and in the case of Nate Robinson, 2 rounds. And then Ben Askren was a scheduled 8-rounder. Tyron Woodley, both of those scheduled 8-rounders. So the first one, competitive fight. In the middle rounds, Woodley hurt Jake Paul, where Jake Paul's, was pretty much kept up by the ropes, some believe. You could watch the tape for yourself and determine whether you think that should have been considered a knockdown, but it was a competitive fight. Jake Paul ended up winning, again, a split decision win. So to me, that was an impressive accomplishment in this whole Jake Paul rise. It's like, okay, you're not fighting Hasim Gibb anymore. You're fighting Tyron Woodley. Look, I watched most of Tyron Woodley's MMA career, and yes, he did end his MMA career with a 5-fight losing streak, where every loss along the way got increasingly worse. He went from losing a 5-round decision to Kamaru Usman, the current champ, and going the full distance, to getting stopped like in the early rounds against Vicente Luque. Nonetheless, in the rematch, when Jake Paul fought Tyron Woodley, who this was supposed to be Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury, just like this Rahman fight was supposed to be Tommy Fury. Tommy Fury pulled out, insert Tyron Woodley on short notice. So this, again, is a scheduled 8-rounder. Tyron Woodley comes in, and this ends up being another competitive fight. It wasn't high action. Like, both of these guys were clearly tired by the middle rounds. And, Jake Paul in this rematch against Woodley suffered his first cut, which I think is another significant occurrence. He gets cut by a headbutt in the 3rd round. He's bleeding a lot. It's a pretty nasty cut. He ends up, he's breathing out of his mouth by like the end of the 3rd round, 4th round. So it's like, oh man, how's Jake Paul going to handle this type of adversity? And so then he starts relying on his jab again. And again, he looks tired. Tyron Woodley's looking to ambush in with uppercuts and straight right hands. And Jake Paul, again, he's trying to jab enough to win the rounds. But again, it's very competitive, and no one of these two are asserting themselves and really taking control of the fight. And then in the 6th round, Jake Paul fakes low, goes high, catches Woodley so flush with the overhand right, shuts his lights off. Arguably, Jake Paul's most devastating knockout to date. And again, he was fighting non-fighters to begin with. And his knockout in the rematch against Woodley might have been the most violent of them all. And he's got a couple highlights already. Super dramatic, kind of saved the day, because it was really anyone's guess who was winning that fight. And Jake Paul, again, suffered a cut. He was clearly tired. This was dire straits, but he ended up pulling out a remarkable lights-out knockout win in the rematch against Tyron Woodley. And now he finds himself again with the late replacement, replacing Tommy Fury. Enter Hasim Rahman. Again, 12 wins, 1 loss. And the thing about this fight is Rahman isn't simply a foil for Jake Paul. This isn't somebody who's, basing their celebrity pro career on Jake Paul's celebrity stardom. No, Hasim Rahman was aspiring to be a professional boxer years before this Jake Paul thing was even a story. I mean, there was one of the All Access episodes. This was when Floyd Mayweather, after he had his years at HBO, and then he developed the 24/7 series, he's got this All Access after he switched to Showtime. And so Hasim Rahman was on one of these episodes fighting in the Mayweather gym, having this they called it Doghouse Rules, a very grueling 30-plus minute sparring session. Hasim Rahman was like a young, aspiring pro boxer at this point, and Hasim Rahman Jr., for those that don't know, son of Hasim Rahman, who was a former heavyweight champion, knocked Lennox Lewis out in one of the biggest upsets in recent heavyweight history, knocked the great Lennox Lewis out, and then got knocked out in the rematch, but then went on to have like a significant several years fighting some of the best, from Evander Holyfield to John Ruiz. He fought David Tua twice. He fought like pretty much the who's who of the heavyweight division. Ended up sticking around long enough to fight one of the Klitschko's. I think he got stopped by Vladimir Klitschko. But yeah, Hasim Rahman, as legit as they come. His son, again, aspiring boxer, to his credit, has a 12-1 record, his only loss coming in his most recent fight against Tommy Morrison's son, James Morrison. This one was a TKO where Rahman Jr. didn't get dropped, but he was clearly tired, and he started looking like he was getting hit with unanswered punches, and like his hands were starting to drop as his back was against the ropes, and he was getting hit by power shots from James Morrison. They stopped the fight. So it wasn't like a lights out knockout loss, but he was getting beaten up pretty badly. And even in the several moments leading to the stoppage, he had his hands down. He looked pretty tired, but Rahman was a serious, and still is a serious, heavyweight fighter. He's not an elite fighter. He's not a top 20, 30, 40 type fighter, but you go through the different tiers in your opponent quality. And depending on the success you have, that's what determines how far you can take your heavyweight career. Rahman, I wouldn't say he totally stalled out. 12-1. No, I don't see his opponent quality getting very good. Although James Morrison, the guy who he lost to, is a 19-0 with 2 draws. So he's got 19 wins, 0 losses, 2 draws. James Morrison, more or less legit, right? Like, I would love to see how Jake Paul would handle a fight against James Morrison, who is a true heavyweight, like Hasim Rahman Jr., which is another key element to this fight, is the weights, but not in the way that you would think. Because Jake Paul has the leverage in these negotiations, I expect that in this Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman Jr. fight, that the 200-pound weight limit that Rahman Jr. is going to have to weigh in at. Like, for instance, when he fought James Morrison in his only loss, he weighed in at 225 pounds. He's going to have to weigh 25 pounds less than that against Jake Paul. Jake Paul is a 190 to 200-poundish fighter. So Hasim Rahman Jr. revealed that he had a call, like Jake Paul's team called him, and he said this to Ak and Barack on the DAZN boxing show. He said that they called him up, were asking a bunch of questions as if he was going to be brought in as a sparring partner, and then within like 24 to 48 hours hit him back up and said, hey, do you want the fight? And basically started laying out the terms. And so I don't know what Rahman told them that he weighed, but I'd imagine like he can't easily get down to 200 pounds, which I think factored into the decision making in choosing Rahman Jr. as the late replacement. So basically Rahman, who's been fighting like anywhere from 225, sometimes as high as 230, 235, is gonna have to weigh in at 200. But not only that, the day after the fight, he can't weigh more than 15 pounds over the weight limit. What usually happens is a lot of fighters who have to drop a bunch of weight to make the limit, they'll usually rehydrate where they'll gain like 20 to even 30 pounds, within a day or two of that scheduled weigh-in. So the official weigh-in. So Rahman Jr. cannot weigh more than 215 pounds when he's entering the ring against Jake Paul. I think that that's going to play a part here, because if I knew that Jake Paul versus Rahman Jr. was going to take place, for instance, at heavyweight, where Rahman would be free to weigh 225 pounds, I would actually pick Rahman Jr. to win this fight. Maybe not by knockout, maybe by knockout, we'll see, but certainly at least by decision. But I expect both of these guys to be like pretty tired by the time we get to the fourth round. Like I'm not too impressed with either of their cardios, although I am surprised that taking up boxing so late that Jake Paul was able to go and win a split decision 8-rounder that went the distance against Woodley in their first fight. That was impressive to me. Jake Paul, I believe, has a nice right hand. We've seen it time and time again. Put Woodley's lights out, put Askren's lights out, Nate Robinson. Like, he's got a very nice overhand right, and he also does have an improving jab. So you couple that with his improving cardio, and now we've seen him bleed in a fight and still persevere. I would normally say, of course, you go with the bona fide pro boxer who's got the 12-1 record, fighting mostly professionals. Granted, the quality level varies among these professionals. Like, you'll see anything from, again, James Morrison, who is 19-0, to Damian Reed, who's 3-19. But nonetheless, Hasim Rahman Jr. is the professional with much more professional boxing experience here. So this is a major, major step up in my view for Jake Paul. But I almost feel like the weight issue might save the day, where Rahman might gas worse than Jake Paul, because when both guys are dog tired, what do you have to rely on at that point? Your heart, your durability, and your skill set. Jake Paul, I think, can at least jab enough to win some of those slow moments against Rahman Jr., and I think he's going to be shooting a right hand, but it's going to be interesting to see what Rahman Jr.'s punch output's going to look like after the first 3 rounds. I've seen Rahman get tired even in, early in his career when he fought like Ronnie Hale, where he gets tired and he starts going on his back foot and his activity decreases like big time. Rahman Jr. himself hasn't gone the 8-round distance in his whole pro career. Like, the ones that he went the distance, those were like 4-rounders. And then there was one that was a 6-rounder. So Rahman's gone the 6-round distance, hasn't gone the 8-round distance. This is an 8-rounder. Jake Paul's gone the 8-round distance once, but it was against a non-professional boxer. Although Tyron Woodley is a talented fighter, even in his late 30s, still a talented fighter who's got a nice right hand. But this will be the first case where Jake Paul is fighting somebody his own size or bigger. Woodley fought at 170 pounds his whole career, or at least his whole relevant part of his MMA, UFC career. Even his strike force before that, 170-ish. Ben Askren, another 170-pounder. So Jake Paul hasn't been fighting guys his own size. Rahman is bigger than Jake Paul. Jake Paul's about 6'1". Rahman is 6'3". Jake Paul fights, again, 190 to 200 pounds, might walk around at maybe 210, whereas Hasim Rahman Jr. has fought as a heavyweight and as like a 225, 230 pound heavyweight. But now he's got to come all the way down to the cruiserweight limit of 200. That worries me, especially when it comes to like conditioning when you head into the middle and then the late rounds. So, I think there's a chance that Rahman Jr. could blow Jake Paul out. And I mean, stop him, in the first couple rounds. I think that Rahman Jr. is actually going to look better in the first couple rounds. Like, if Jake Paul comes out and wins the first round and then wins the second round, I would be pretty damn surprised. It's like you are not even you are a pro boxer in the sense that you are having these sanctioned professional fights, but this is your pro debut against a pro boxer, and you win the first and second round against somebody who's got the size and experience over you. That would be super impressive. So I don't think that that's going to happen. I actually think that Jake Paul is going to have to bite down and dig deep in the middle rounds, and I think he's going to have to outlast and outwork Rahman Jr. here. Like, I don't think that the right hand will save the day for Jake Paul. Yes, I think that he might catch Rahman with a nice right hand. If he drops him with it, that would be super impressive. But I think Rahman Jr. is going to win the early rounds, but I think he's going to start to tire by the 4th and 5th round, and Jake Paul is going to have to basically dig deep and rely on that cardio that he had to rely on in both of those Woodley fights. Because keep in mind, he knocks Woodley out in the 6th round. I thought that him securing a relatively late round knockout, again, hugely impressive. Like, there's so many steps on this whole Jake Paul story that have been immensely impressive to me. Like, his work ethic, he's obviously training his butt off, getting into boxing shape, and when the lights are the brightest and he's having to, do a lot of the promotion, and he is basically the engine that's keeping this whole thing going, right? Like, his social media behaviors, his interviews that he's giving, just everything, him taking Floyd Mayweather's hat before the Floyd Mayweather versus Logan Paul fight. Like, he's always getting after it, both from a marketing standpoint and obviously with the training as well. In fact, Jake Paul is insistent. Like, when you hear him talk in the interviews, he is convinced that and in the press conference with Rahman Jr., he sounds convinced that he's been working harder than Rahman Jr. over the past couple years. He sounds like he truly believes that he's more prepared for this than Rahman Jr. is. And these guys have sparred before. They've got history together in training. So only they know how those training sessions went. Jake Paul says that, man, he was, in certain spots, he was getting his butt whooped by Rahman. He admits that these were rough sessions, but he's also sounding super confident that he's going to have what it takes to get this done against Rahman. And to me, that's a little bit astounding. So there's pressure on both sides here. On Rahman Jr., like, your whole pro career goes to shambles if Jake Paul, the YouTuber turned boxer, beats you. Whether he beats you by decision or stops you, there's a lot of pressure here. Granted, Rahman Jr. is going to make more money than he's made in any of his other fights in this bout, but from your pro career's credibility standpoint, it's one thing getting beaten by a son of a former heavyweight belt holder, James Morrison, again, son of Tommy Morrison. It's another thing if Jake Paul comes out and beats you, right? So there's pressure on both sides here. I actually think that Jake Paul is going to have to display a ton of heart. And again, I was about to come into this video to pick Hasim Rahman to win by decision. I thought Jake Paul would have enough heart, but I thought Rahman Jr.'s professional skills were going to win the day. But then I was really starting to overthink about the size requirements here. And I think that is going to play into Rahman Jr.'s stamina from rounds, say, 4 through 8, to where I think Jake Paul is actually going to be able to outwork Rahman rounds 6 through 8, where if he needs to pull out like 2 of the last 3 rounds, then he's actually going to be able to do so. When Rahman Jr. starts looking like he's tired, he starts dropping his hands, he starts just taking a step back, I think that is going to give Jake Paul opportunities to just flick a jab out. I think that when both of these guys are tired, it's going to turn into a sloppy jab battle. I don't expect this to look like an elegant professional fight. These are 2 relatively low-level pro boxers, so I think that they're going to look as gassed and as sloppy as they feel. But I expect Jake to outwork Rahman in the last few rounds. And I'm actually going to go Jake Paul to win via close decision over Rahman Jr. And to me, if he does pull that off, that will be his biggest feat. So it's like every time he's been entering the ring, he's kind of been outdoing himself, right? Him winning a split decision over Woodley was more impressive to me than him knocking out Ben Askren, Nate Robinson, and Anason Gibb. But then him returning in the rematch and knocking Woodley out, that superseded everything else. And if he's able to beat Rahman, even if it's via decision, to me, that will be another significant level up. And again, in the days leading up to this, to me recording this video, I was thinking that I was going to pick Rahman Jr., but I started to really think about the weight requirements here, and I'm thinking that might give Jake Paul just enough of a stamina drop-off in the middle rounds for Rahman Jr. for Jake Paul to then come on strong. He's like the younger fighter. Rahman's not old. He's 32 years old. And granted, I think that James Morrison is better than Jake Paul, all right? So I wouldn't pick Jake Paul to beat James Morrison unless he made James Morrison come down to like 190 pounds or something like that. But James Morrison, 19-0. But I think Jake Paul is going to do the improbable, even though, amazingly, if you look at the betting odds, Jake Paul is a minus 220 favorite. So they have him as a greater than 2-1 favorite in this fight, which that's just mind-blowing. And it almost requires like a leap of faith for these odds to even make sense, right? You have to be buying into the Jake Paul hype, and you have to be, quote unquote, following the money. Like, are they gonna let Hasim Rahman Jr. spoil this whole, money train that Jake Paul's been on, right? And that his whole team has been on? Is Rahman Jr. going to be able to spoil that? And granted, there's a lot of shadiness in boxing in general, but I'm going to assume here that this fight is on the up and up, right? Because, of course, if you start buying into the likelihood or the thought that there could be some shadiness that, you get what I'm saying in terms of the boxing corruption that would make these 220 odds for Jake Paul make sense. I'm going to err on the side of fairness and this fight, again, being legit. And if this fight is legit, then those odds are crazy. It should, if anything, be closer to even money. Again, I mean, even the height discrepancy. Jake Paul hasn't fought anybody near his height, let alone somebody who's 2 inches taller than him. So your jab doesn't work the same way as when you're fighting guys who are 3 inches shorter than you. Your right hand won't be as easy to deploy in terms of being able to gauge the range and so forth. Rahman's a bigger dude. Even if he's going to be a bit weight drained potentially, he's a bigger guy. So but I'm still going to go with Jake Paul to win via decision. I just think that his jab is improving. I think that he's been working hard, and I think that there's a strong possibility that he might still have more left in the tank in rounds 6 through 8 than Hasim Rahman Jr. does. It's not going to be pretty. I think there's going to be a lot of holding, a lot of clinching, a lot of inactivity in spots, but I think Jake Paul's going to do enough to win this one via decision. But yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this. But yeah, let me know what you think about Jake Paul versus Hasim Rahman Jr. in the comments. And please, like the video. And by the way, if Jake Paul does pass this test, which again, I think that this is his toughest test. I truly believe that. If he does pass this, do you circle back and try to fight Tommy Fury again? Do you try to fight the guy that Rahman fought, or is the weight just too much of an issue for Jake Paul to, for instance, try to fight James Morrison? Does James Morrison even have a big enough name for it to be worth it for Jake Paul? Or do you go more the Anderson Silva or maybe Nate Diaz, depending on how he comes out of that fight with Khamzat Chimaev? Like, do you try to set one of those types of fights up rather than fighting maybe even a more proven pro boxer than Hasim Rahman Jr. is? Like, where do you think Jake Paul goes? And it probably largely depends on how this fight with Rahman Jr. goes. Again, I would not be surprised if Rahman Jr. stops Jake Paul early, but I'm going to take Jake Paul via decision. I feel like that's slightly more likely the outcome. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.